Herman Kahn was a founder of the Hudson Institute and one of the preeminent futurists of the latter part of the 20th century. He originally came to prominence as a military strategist and systems theorist while employed at the RAND Corporation. He became known for analyzing the likely consequences of nuclear war and recommending ways to improve survivability, making him one of three historical inspirations for the title character of Stanley Kubrick's classic black comedy film satire Dr.Strangelove. His theories contributed heavily to the development of the nuclear strategy of the United States. Background: Kahn was born in Bayonne, New Jersey, the son of Yetta and Abraham Kahn, a tailor. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. He was raised in the Bronx, then in Los Angeles following his parents' divorce. Raised Jewish, he later became an atheist. He attended the University of California, Los Angeles, majoring in physics. During World War II, he was stationed by the Army as a telephone linesman in Burma. After the war, he completed his BS degree at UCLA and embarked on a doctorate at Caltech. He dropped out for financial reasons, but did receive an MSc. Following a brief stint in real estate, he joined the RAND Corporation via his friend Samuel Cohen, the inventor of the neutron bomb. He became involved with the development of the hydrogen bomb, commuting to the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in Northern California to work closely with Edward Teller, John von Neumann, Hans Bethe, and Albert Wohlstetter. Cold War theories. Kahn's major contributions were the several strategies he developed during the Cold War to contemplate the unthinkable, namely, nuclear warfare, by using applications of game theory. Kahn is often cited as a father of scenario planning. During the mid-1950s, the Eisenhower administration's prevailing nuclear strategy had been one of massive retaliation, enunciated by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. According to this theory, dubbed the New Look, the Soviet army was considerably larger than that of the United States and therefore presented a potential security threat in too many locations for the Americans to counter effectively at once. Consequently, the United States had no choice but to proclaim that its response to any Soviet aggression anywhere would be a nuclear attack. Kahn considered this theory untenable because it was crude and potentially destabilizing. He argued that New Look theory invited nuclear attack by providing the Soviet Union with an incentive to precede any conventional localized military action somewhere in the world with a nuclear attack on U.S. bomber bases, thereby eliminating the Americans' nuclear threat immediately and forcing the United States into the land war it sought to avoid. In 1960, as Cold War tensions were near the peak following the Sputnik crisis and amidst talk of a widening missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union, Kahn published on thermonuclear war, the title of which clearly alluded to On War, the classic 19th-century treatise by the German military strategist Karl von Clausewitz. Kahn rested his theory upon two premises, one obvious, one highly controversial. First, nuclear war was obviously feasible, since the United States and the Soviet Union currently had massive nuclear arsenals aimed at each other. Second, like any other war, it was winnable. Whether hundreds of millions died or merely a few major cities were destroyed, Kahn argued life would go on as it had. For instance, after the Black Death in Europe during the 14th century, or in Japan after the limited nuclear attack in 1945. Contrary to the conventional, prevailing doomsday scenarios, various outcomes might be far more horrible than anything hitherto witnessed or imagined, but some of them nonetheless could be far worse worse than others, no matter how calamitous the devastation. Kahn argued that the survivors ultimately would not envy the dead, and to believe otherwise would mean that deterrence was unnecessary in the first place. If Americans were unwilling to accept the consequences, no matter how horrifying, of a nuclear exchange, then they certainly had no business proclaiming the willingness to attack. Without an unfettered, unambivalent willingness to push the button, the entire array of preparations and military deployments was merely an elaborate bluff. The bases of his work were systems theory and game theory as applied to economics and military strategy. Kahn argued that for deterrence to succeed, the Soviet Union had to be convinced that the United States had second strike capability in order to leave the Politburo in no doubt that even a perfectly coordinated massive attack would guarantee a measure of retaliation that would leave them devastated as well. At the minimum, an adequate deterrent for the United States must provide an objective basis for a Soviet calculation that would persuade them that, no matter how skillful or ingenious they were, an attack on the United States would lead to a very high risk if not certainty of large-scale destruction to Soviet civil society and military forces. Superficially, this reasoning resembles the elder doctrine of mutually assured destruction due to John von Neumann. Although Kahn was one of its vocal critics, strong conventional forces were also a key element in Kahn's strategic thinking. He argued that the tension generated by relatively minor flashpoints worldwide could be dissipated without resort to the nuclear option, the unthinkable. Due to his willingness to articulate the most brutal possibilities, Kahn came to be disliked by some, although he was known as amiable in private, especially around children. Unlike most strategists, he was entirely willing to posit the form a post-nuclear world might assume. Fallout, for example, would simply be another one of life's many unpleasantnesses and inconveniences, while the much ballyhooed rise in birth defects would not doom mankind to extinction because a majority of survivors would remain unaffected by them. Contaminated food could be designated for consumption by the elderly, who would presumably die before the delayed onset of cancers caused by radioactivity. A degree of even modest preparation, namely, the fallout shelters, evacuation scenarios and civil defense drills now seen as emblematic of the Cold War, would give the population both the incentive and the encouragement to rebuild. He even recommended the government offer homeowners insurance against nuclear bomb damage. Kahn felt that having a strong civil defense program in place would serve as an additional deterrent, because it would hamper the other side's potential to inflict destruction and thus lessen the attraction of the nuclear option. A willingness to tolerate such possibilities, Kahn argued, might be worth sparing Europe the massive nuclear exchange more likely to occur under the preeminent doctrine. A number of pacifists, including A.J. Must and Bertrand Russell, admired and praised Kahn's work because they felt it presented a strong case for full disarmament by suggesting that nuclear war was all but unavoidable. Others criticized Kahn vehemently, claiming that his postulating the notion of a winnable nuclear war made such a war, whether judged subsequently as one lost, or neither, more likely. Hudson Institute and Vietnam War. In 1961, Kahn, Max Singer and Oskar Rubhausen founded the Hudson Institute, a policy research organization initially located in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, where Kahn was living at the time. Luminaries such as sociologist Daniel Bell, political philosopher Raymond Aron and novelist Ralph Ellison were recruited. Stung by the vociferousness of his critics, Kahn somewhat softened his tone and responded to their points in thinking about the unthinkable and on escalation. Between 1966 and 1968, during the peak of the Vietnam War, Kahn served as a consultant to the Department of Defense and opposed the growing pressure to negotiate directly with North Vietnam, arguing that the only military solution was sharp escalation. Failing that, he said, the U.S. government needed an exit strategy. He claimed credit for introducing the term Vietnamization. Kahn and the Hudson Institute advised against starting a counterinsurgency war in Vietnam, but, once it had begun, they gave advice on how to wage it. In an interview, he said that he and the Institute preferred not to give advice to the Secretary of Defense, because disagreement at such a high level might be regarded as treason, whereas disagreement with, say, the Deputy Undersecretary was regarded as no more than technical. As regards a plan, British advisers with experience from the Commonwealth's successful counterinsurgency war in Malaya were consulted. Kahn and the Institute, however, judged that a crucial difference between the Vietnamese and Malayan situations was the British Rural Constabulary in Malaya. An Institute study of the major counterinsurgency wars in recent history found a 100% correlation between successful wars and effective police forces. Kahn said, "The purpose of an army is to protect your police force. We had an army in Vietnam without a purpose." The year 2000. In 1967, Herman Kahn and Anthony J. Weiner published the year 2000, a framework for speculation on the next 33 years, which included contributions from staff members of the Hudson Institute and an introduction by Daniel Bell. Table 18 in the document contains a list called 100 technical innovations very likely in the last third of the 20th century. The first 10 predictions were multiple applications of lasers, extreme high-strength structural materials, new or improved super-performance fabrics, new or improved materials for equipment and appliances, new airborne vehicles, extensive commercial applications of shaped charge explosives, more reliable and longer-range weather forecasting, extensive and/or intensive expansion of tropical agriculture and forestry, new sources of power for fixed installations, new sources of power for ground transportation. The remaining 90 predictions included 26. Widespread use of nuclear reactors for power. 38. New techniques for cheap and reliable birth control. 41. Improved capability to change sex of children and/or adults. 57. Automated universal credit, audit and banking systems. 67. Commercial extraction of oil from shale. 68. Recoverable boosters for economic space launching. 74. Pervasive business use of computers. 81. Personal pages. 84. Home computers to run households and communicate with the outside world. Later years, with the easing of nuclear tensions during the détente years of the 1970s, Kahn continued his work on futurism and speculations about the potential for Armageddon. He and the Hudson Institute sought to refute popular apocalyptic essays such as Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. Garrett Hardin similarly reasoned the tragedy of the commons and the Club of Rome's limits to growth. In Kahn's view, capitalism and technology held nearly boundless potential for progress, while the colonization of space lay in the near, not the distant, future. Kahn's 1976 book The Next 200 Years, written with William Brown and Leon Mardle, presented an optimistic scenario of economic conditions in the year 2176. He also wrote a number of books extrapolating the future of the American, Japanese and Australian economies and several works on systems theory, including the well-received 1956 monograph Techniques of System Analysis. During the mid-1970s, when South Korea's GDP per capita was one of the lowest in the world, Kahn predicted that the country would become one of the top 10 most powerful countries in the world by the year 2000. In his last year, 1983, Kahn wrote approvingly of Ronald Reagan's political agenda in The Coming Boom, economic, political, and social, and bluntly derided Jonathan Scull's claims about the long-term effects of nuclear war. On July 7 that year, he died of a stroke, aged 61. Cultural influence. Along with John von Neumann, Edward Teller and Wernher von Braun, Kahn was, reportedly, an inspiration for the character Dr. Strangelove in the eponymous film by Stanley Kubrick released in 1964. It was also said that Kubrick immersed himself in Kahn's book on thermonuclear war. In the film, Dr. Strangelove refers to a report on the Doomsday Machine by the RAND Corporation. Kahn met Kubrick and gave him the idea for the Doomsday Machine, a device which would immediately cause the destruction of the entire planet in the event of a nuclear attack. Both the name and the concept of the weapon are drawn from the text of On Thermonuclear War. Louis Menon observes, in Kahn's book, the Doomsday Machine is an example of the sort of deterrent that appeals to the military mind but that is dangerously destabilizing. Since nations are not suicidal, its only use is to threaten. Walter Matthau's maverick character, Professor Gros-Etichel, in the film Fail-Safe, also released in 1964, is also based on Kahn. In The Politics of Ecstasy, Timothy Leary suggests that Kahn had taken LSD. Publications. Outside Physics and Statistics. Works written by Kahn include 1960. On Thermonuclear War, Princeton University Press, ISBN 0-313-200602. 1962. Thinking About the Unthinkable, Horizon Press. 1965. On Escalation, Metaphors and Scenarios, Prager. 1967. The Year 2000, A Framework for Speculation on the Next 33 Years, Macmillan. ISBN 002-5604406. With Anthony Weiner. 1968. Can We Win in Vietnam? Prager. Kahn with 4 other authors, Gastiel, Raymond E. Pfaff, William Stillman, Edmund Armbruster, Frankie. 1970. The Emerging Japanese Superstate, Challenge and Response. Prentice Hall. ISBN 0-13-2746-700. 1971. The Japanese Challenge, The Success and Failure of Economic Success. Morrow, Andre Deutsch. ISBN 0-688-087-108. 1972. Things to Come, Thinking About the 70s and 80s. Macmillan. ISBN 002-5604708. With B. Bruce Briggs. 1973. Herman Consciousness, The Megaton Ideas of the One-Man Think Tank. New American Library. Selected and edited by Jerome Agel. 1974. The Future of the Corporation. Mason and Amp, Lipscomb. ISBN 088405092. 1976. The Next 200 Years, a Scenario for America and the World. Morrow. ISBN 0-688-08029-4. 1979. World Economic Development, 1979 and Beyond. William Morrow, Croom-Helm. ISBN 0-688-03479-9. With Hollander, Jeffrey, and Hollander, John A. 1981. Will She Be Right? The Future of Australia. University of Queensland Press. ISBN 0-7022-1569-4. With Thomas Pepper, 1983. The Coming Boom, Economic, Political, and Social. Simon and Amp, Schuster, Hutchinson. ISBN 0-671-492659. 1984. Thinking About the Unthinkable in the 1980s. New York, Simon and Schuster. ISBN 0-671-4754444. The Nature and Feasibility of War, Deterrence, and Arms Control. A Slightly Optimistic World Context for 1975 to 2000. Social Limits to Growth, Creeping Stagnation versus Natural and Inevitable. A New Kind of Class Struggle in the United States. Works published by the RAND Corporation involving Kahn. The Nature and Feasibility of War and Deterrence. RAND Corporation. Paper P1888 RC 1960. Some specific suggestions for achieving early non-military defense capabilities and initiating long-range programs. RAND Corporation Research Memorandum RM2206 RC 1958. Report on a Study of Non-Military Defense. RAND Corporation Report R322 RC 1958. Herman Kahn and Erwin Mann. Wargaming. RAND Corporation Paper P1167 1957. Herman Kahn and Erwin Mann. 10 Common Pitfalls. RAND Research Memorandum RM1937 PR 1957. Herman Kahn. Stochastic Attenuation Analysis. Santa Monica, Calif. RAND Corp.